Soon after the planes took off on this second mission, the weather closed in again, and even neighbouring ships occasionally could not see one another. The attack planes, unable to keep formation, returned in scattered small groups crawling just above the sea. Most of their engines were wheezing and coughing because of the freezing cold as they returned over the carriers. The men in the ships held their breath as they watched the planes stagger down onto the flight deck one after another. Once all the carrier planes were on board, the Kakuta force continued to advance until it was some 100 miles from the enemy shore. Meanwhile, the 4 Type 95 two-seater reconnaissance seaplanes, Daves or Peets from Takao and Maya, had continued their daring advance through the stormy weather. They were intercepted by enemy fighters, however, and a dogfight ensued in which 2 of them were downed and the other 2 suffered some damage, though they managed to return near their ships. Both the crippled planes broke up in the water the moment they landed, but the injured crewmen were rescued. Thus ended the first day's operations in the northern area. It was now clear that the Americans had air bases on or near Unalaska, but their location was as completely unknown as that of the hidden stars beyond the thick fog. The Dutch harbour attack had inflicted little actual damage on the enemy. More important, it proved entirely ineffective in achieving its diversionary objective, since the Americans were already well aware that the main Japanese attack was directed at Midway. Far to the south, the submarine elements assigned to the A and B cordon lines between Midway and the main Hawaiian Islands at last took up their stations during the 3rd of June, 2 days behind schedule. Each submarine remained submerged during the day and surfaced at night, never relaxing its lookout for enemy forces coming from the direction of Pearl Harbor. But they had arrived too late. The enemy ships had already passed the positions of the cordons and moved far to the west. Meanwhile, the afternoon of the 3rd found the Nagumo force heading southeast for Midway at 24 knots. The force was cruising in a compact ring formation with the 4 carriers in the center. The perimeter was formed by battleships Haruna and Kirishima, heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, light cruiser Nagara, and 12 destroyers. Suddenly, at 1940, heavy cruiser Tone hoisted an urgent signal reporting approximately 10 enemy planes sighted on bearing 260 degrees. 3 Akagi fighters took off immediately to intercept, but as they encountered no enemy planes, and as no air attack came, it was concluded that Tone's report had been erroneous. After this brief alarm, the force continued on undisturbed until 0230, the 4th of June. Then one of Akagi's lookouts reported, "What appears to be the light of an enemy contact plane sighted on starboard beam, bearing 070 degree, above the clouds, approaching." Every man on the bridge strained his eyes in the reported direction, but nothing was in sight. Nevertheless, Captain Aoki, who had not once left the bridge since departing from the homeland, instantly ordered general quarters, and all hands hurried to their stations. Stars, both bright and dim, blinked through the scattered clouds and gained motion from the roll of the ship. After half a minute of futile watching and waiting, the captain called the lookout and asked if he still saw the reported light. A slight pause preceded the reluctant reply, "No, sir, I have lost it." The captain then cautioned all lookouts against mistaking stars for moving lights due to the motion of the ship. "Make sure of your sightings before reporting," he ordered. Mumbled responses indicated that the lookouts understood the warning, and again there was silence. The captain was about to secure the ship from general quarters when the same lookout suddenly shouted another warning. "Light sighted in the same direction! It is not a star!" An anti-aircraft alert order was immediately flashed to all ships of the force, but again all efforts to confirm the presence of an enemy plane proved vain. Now, 0 hour for launching the strike on Midway was rapidly approaching. Promptly at 0245, Akagi's loudspeakers barked an order turning out air crews assigned to the attack. Maintenance men were already preparing the planes for takeoff, and there was a deafening roar of motors starting and warming up. The noise and pre-takeoff excitement throughout the ship roused Commander Gender, Staff Operations Officer, who had been confined to sickbay shortly after our departure because of a high fever which, it was feared, betokened pneumonia. Now, unwilling to miss the launching of the attack, he made his way to the bridge. There he encountered Admiral Nagumo, who placed an arm around his shoulder, and asked how he was feeling. "I am very sorry, sir, to have been absent so long. I have a slight temperature, but am feeling much better now." Genda's feverish eyes betrayed that he was much sicker than he was willing to admit, but they also sparkled with fighting spirit. Genda's appearance on the bridge was a moving inspiration to every man present. For more than 6 months he had played a leading role in planning and directing the successful operations of the Nagumo force. It bolstered the morale of everyone to see him again at Admiral Nagumo's side, ready for battle. With his attack groups about to take off for Midway, Admiral Nagumo still was without information of enemy fleet activity. Wartime records disclose that just prior to launching the attack, Admiral Nagumo estimated, or rather misestimated, the enemy situation as follows. "The enemy fleet will probably come out to engage when the Midway landing operations are begun. Enemy air patrols from Midway will be heavier to westward and southward, less heavy to the north and northwest. The radius of enemy air patrols is estimated to be approximately 500 miles. Editor's note. This estimate appears strange in view of the encounter mentioned earlier between Japanese and American patrol planes 700 miles from Midway on the 30th of May, the 1st of June, Japan time. Evidently, Admiral Nagumo was unaware of this contact. 4. The enemy is not yet aware of our plan, and he has not yet detected our task force. 5. There is no evidence of an enemy task force in our vicinity. 6. It is therefore possible for us to attack Midway, destroy land-based planes there, and support the landing operation. We can then turn around, meet an approaching enemy task force, and destroy it. 7. Possible counterattacks by enemy land-based air can surely be repulsed by our interceptors and anti-aircraft fire. Such was the sad misjudgment under which Admiral Nagumo, through no fault of his own, led the proud Japanese carrier striking force into a battle that would see it smashed beyond repair. The Nagumo force fights search for the enemy. At about 0300 on the morning of the 4th of June, the noisy drone of plane engines warming up roused me from slumber. I got out of bed and attempted to stand, but my legs were still unsteady. The sound of engines alternately hummed and then rose to a whining roar. Akagi was preparing to launch her planes for the attack on Midway. Unable to resist the desire to be topside at takeoff time, I slipped out of the sick bay. The watertight doors of every bulkhead had been closed, leaving only a small manhole in each door open for passage. It was an arduous task to squeeze through these small openings in my weakened condition, and cold sweat soon ran down my forehead. I frequently felt exhausted and dizzy and had to squat on the floor to rest. The passageways were empty. All hands were at their stations. Lights were dimmed for combat condition, and one could see a distance of only a few feet. With great effort, I finally climbed the ladders up to my cabin just below the flight deck, clutching the handrails every step of the way. There I paused long enough to catch my breath and put on a uniform before going on to the flight control post. The first wave attack planes were all lined up on the flight deck. The warm-up was completed and the roar of the engines subsided. I found Commander Masuda, air officer of Akagi, in charge of flight preparations. My colleagues expressed concern over my leaving bed, but they understood when I explained that I could not bear to hear the sound of the engines and remain below in sick bay. I looked up at the dark sky. The dawn still seemed far off. The sky was cloudy, and the weather, while not good, was not bad enough to prevent flying. The sea was calm. I asked Lieutenant Furukawa when sunrise would be. "At 0500, sir," was the reply. "Have search planes already been sent out?" "No, sir. They will be launched at the same time as the first attack wave." "Are we using the single-phase search system?" "Yes, sir, as usual." I recalled the attacks on Colombo and Trincomalee in the Indian Ocean 2 months earlier, when single-phase search had been employed. It had not been a wise tactic. In both instances, the searches had spotted enemy surface forces while our attack groups were away hitting the enemy bases, and this had caused our carriers some anxious moments. With this in mind, I inquired what plans had been made for the eventuality that our search planes might sight an enemy fleet during the Midway attack. "No need to worry about that," Lieutenant Commander Murata replied. "After the first attack wave departs, the second wave, consisting of Lieutenant Commander Igusa's dive bombers, my torpedo bombers, and Lieutenant Commander Itaya's Zeros, will be available to attack any enemy surface force that might be discovered." "I see. Well, that's a good team, and we can just hope that the enemy fleet does come out so we can destroy it. What searches are scheduled?" Furukawa explained them to me on the map board. "There are 7 lines extending east and south, with Midway lying within the search arc. We are using 1 plane each from Akagi and Kaga, 2 seaplanes each from Toni and Chikuma, and 1 from Haruna. The search radius is 300 miles for all planes except Haruna's, which is a Type 95 and can do only half that." Although the coverage appeared adequate, I still felt that a 2-phase search would have been wiser. A single-phase search might be sufficient if we wished only to confirm our assumption that no enemy fleet was in the vicinity. However, if we recognized the possibility that this assumption might be wrong and that an enemy force might be present, our searches should have been such as to assure that we could locate and attack it before it could strike at us. For this purpose, a 2-phase dawn search was the logical answer. As the term indicates, a 2-phase search employs 2 sets of planes which fly the same search lines, with a given time interval between them. Since our planes were not equipped with radar at this time, they were completely reliant on visual observation and could search effectively only by daylight. Consequently, to spot an enemy force as soon as possible after dawn, it was necessary to have 1 set of planes, the first phase, launched in time to reach the end of their search radius as day was breaking. This meant that the areas traversed in darkness on their outbound flight remained unsearched. Hence, a second phase search was required over these same lines by planes taking off about 1 hour later. Men assigned to the first phase of such a search obviously had to be well trained in night flying. Nagumo had such pilots and could have used this method, but it would have required twice as many planes as a single-phase search. Despite the importance of conducting adequate searches, our naval strategists were congenitally reluctant to devote more than a bare minimum of their limited plane strength to such missions. 10% of total strength was all they were willing to spare for search operations, feeling that the rest should be reserved for offensive use. But such overemphasis on offensive strength had proven detrimental to our purposes before this, and it would again. Naturally enough, Admiral Nagumo was eager to devote maximum strength to the Midway attack, and did not want to use any more planes for search than seemed absolutely necessary. Since he had no reason to suspect the presence of an enemy force in the area, he was satisfied that a single-phase search was adequate precaution against the unexpected. Search planes from Akagi and Kaga were launched at 0430 simultaneously with the departure of the first Midway attack wave. Haruna's seaplane was also catapulted at this time, but the Tone and Chikuma planes, which were covering the center lines of the search pattern, were delayed. Watching the 2 cruisers, I noticed that the last of their search planes did not get off until just before sunrise, nearly half an hour behind schedule. It was later learned that Tony's planes had been held up by catapult trouble, while one of Chikuma's planes had a bulky engine. This last plane was forced to turn back at 0635 when the engine trouble recurred, and it ran into foul weather. Although poorly advised, a 1-phase search dispatched half an hour before sunrise would still have been helpful if everything had worked out as planned. But the delay in launching Tone's planes sowed a seed which bore fatal fruit for the Japanese in the ensuing naval action. Reviewing the full story of the battle on both sides, we now know that the enemy task force was missed by Chikuma's search plane, which, according to the plan, should have flown directly over it. The enemy force was discovered only when the belated Tone plane, on the line south of the Chikuma plane, was on the dogleg of its search. Had Admiral Nagumo carried out an earlier and more carefully planned 2-phase search, Had the observer of the Chikuma plane been more watchful on the outward leg of his search, or had the seaplanes been catapulted on schedule, the disaster that followed might have been avoided. The fundamental cause of this failure, again, lay in the Japanese Navy's overemphasis on attack, which resulted in inadequate attention to search and reconnaissance. In both the training and organization of our naval aviators, too much importance and effort were devoted to attack. Reconnaissance was taught only as part of the regular curriculum, and no subsequent special training was given. Also, there were no organic reconnaissance units of any appreciable size in the Japanese Navy. When reconnaissance missions were required, attack planes were usually refitted and assigned to perform them. There were no carrier-borne planes designed solely for search. In the Pearl Harbor attack, every carrier-borne bomber of Nagumo's 6 carriers was assigned to the attack, leaving for search only some 10-odd float planes from the accompanying battleships and cruisers. This had been perhaps the basic reason for Admiral Nagumo's decision to withdraw upon that occasion without exploiting his advantage. At the critical moment when he had to decide whether to launch another attack on Pearl Harbor, he did not have the vital information which reconnaissance planes could have provided. The Nagumo force continued to suffer from this same lack of aerial reconnaissance in every action that followed. While searching for the British fleet in the Indian Ocean earlier in the year, our search planes often lost their way, and the carriers had to send out radio signals on which they could home. This, however, also alerted the enemy to our position, and the result was an understandable reluctance on the part of Admiral Nagumo and his staff to send out search planes if it could possibly be avoided. This reluctance was still present in the Midway operation, and, coupled with the erroneous estimate of the enemy situation, was responsible for the inadequate search dispositions ordered by Admiral Nagumo. One small step toward remedying the search weakness of the Nagumo force had been taken prior to the sortie for Midway. After prolonged negotiations with the authorities, Nagumo had succeeded in getting 2 carrier-based reconnaissance planes of a new type, on which experiments had just been completed. This type had been designed originally as a dive bomber, but was altered for use as a search plane. It was later designated the Type 2 carrier-borne reconnaissance plane, or Suisei, Judy, dive bomber, and there were high expectations for its success in reconnoitering enemy task forces. 2 of these planes had been loaded on board Soryu before departure. In the morning of the 4th of June, Admiral Nagumo and his staff were still unaware that the Japanese transport group had been sighted and attacked by planes from Midway. Akebono Maru was the only ship hit, and she was not damaged enough to hinder her progress. But the important thing was that the enemy was fully alerted to the presence of Japanese ships approaching in the direction of Midway, and we did not know that they knew. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 4th of June, at a point 240 miles northwest of Midway, the first attack wave was about to take off from Admiral Nagumo's carriers for the strike on Midway. A southeasterly breeze and calm sea provided ideal launching conditions. The eastern sky was tinged with a faint glow which dimly outlined the horizon. It was 40 minutes before sunup when the loudspeakers barked out the command, "Aviators, assemble!" There was a quick scurry of pilots to the briefing room under the bridge. Too weary to follow, I remained alone at the flight control station. The flyers were soon back on deck, running toward their planes. The air officer returned to the control post and began shouting a quick succession of orders. "All hands to launching stations." "Start engines! Captain, head full into the wind and increase speed for a relative velocity of 14 meters. Editor's note, wind speed per second, equivalent to 19.2 miles per hour. Editor's note, wind speed per second, equivalent to 19.2 miles per hour. Editor's note, wind speed per second, equivalent to 19.2 miles per hour. Plane engines were started, and livid white flames spurted from exhaust pipes. The flight deck was soon a hell of ear-shattering noise. Lieutenant Takehiko Chihaya, in full flying gear, stopped briefly at the flight control station and bade me goodbye. I wished him luck and watched him go nimbly down a ladder and jump into the cockpit of his lead dive bomber, waiting near the base of the bridge. The wing lights of his plane blinked on, indicating that he was ready, and soon the blue and red lights of all the planes glowed in the darkness. "All planes ready, sir," an orderly reported. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the flight deck, making day of the night. "Planes ready for takeoff, sir," the air officer reported to the ship's captain. Akagi was steaming full into the wind with speed increased, and the wind gauge showed the required velocity. "Commence launching," came the order from the bridge. Swinging a green signal lamp, the air officer described a big circle in the air. A Zero fighter, leading the flock of impatient warbirds, revved up its engine, gathered speed along the flight deck, and rose into the air to the accompaniment of a thunderous cheer from Akagi's crew. Caps and hands waved wildly in the bright glare of the deck lights. The first plane was followed by 8 more Zeros. Then came the dive bombers, each carrying a 250-kilogram land bomb. The canopy of Chihaya's plane was open, and the young leader waved goodbye to the cheering hands on deck. The next instant, the plane rose into the darkness with a loud roar. Soon all 18 dive bombers were in the air. Overhead, a neat array of red and blue lights showed that the Zeros were in formation. Some 4,000 meters to port, Hiryu was also launching planes. Thin streaks of light followed each other skyward from the floodlit deck. In 15 minutes, the 4 carriers had launched a total of 108 planes. While forming up, they made a great circle over the fleet and then headed off into the southeastern sky at 0445. Overall commander of the first attack wave was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, personally leading 36 Type 97 level bombers from Soryu and Hiryu. To his left followed 36 Type 99 dive bombers from Akagi and Kaga, led by Lieutenant Shoichi Ogawa, a Kaga squadron commander. Lieutenant Masaharu Shuganami of Soryu led the fighter escort of 36 Zeros, 9 from each carrier. 108 planes in all. This was Tomonaga's first sortie of the Pacific War. He had reported to Hiryu just before her departure from the homeland. He was, however, a veteran of the Sino-Japanese War and a capable and experienced flyer, well qualified to lead the attack. Lieutenant Ogawa, a gallant pilot, had been in every action of the Nagumo force since Pearl Harbor. His skill and daring were unequaled in the Naval Air Corps. Lieutenant Shuganami, like most of the pilots, was also a veteran of the Pacific War since the Pearl Harbor attack. Full of fighting spirit, he was a typical fighter pilot. All the other pilots were well trained, and most were experienced. They worked together well as a team. I watched their lights disappear into the darkness, regretting my illness and praying for their good luck. The flight deck, which moments before had been filled with a deafening din, was now silent. There were no planes, no drone of engines. Only a few deckhands ran here and there, busily stowing various pieces of gear. But the stillness was again broken by the raucous loudspeaker as it blared out the order, "Prepare second attack wave." To the accompaniment of clanging bells, planes soon were being whisked up to the flight deck and rolled from the elevators to their line-up positions. The forward elevators brought up fighters. The midship and stern elevators delivered bombers. Maintenance crews wheeled torpedoes from the ammunition rooms and secured them to the planes. All hands worked feverishly. There was no time for rest as the first light of dawn was beginning to brighten the eastern sky. It was 0500 when the crimson sun rose over the horizon. The flight deck was again filled with planes ready to attack in the event an enemy task force appeared. The dive bombers each carried one 250-kilogram bomb, and the level bombers each carried a torpedo. The second attack wave also totaled 108 planes, 36 Type 99 dive bombers, 18 each from Hiryu and Soryu, 36 Type 97 torpedo bombers, 18 each from Akagi and Kaga, and 36 Zero fighters. The dive bomber group was led by Lieutenant Commander Takashige Egusa from Soryu, long the Navy's leading expert in dive bombing. When Japan began girding herself for war, his dive bomber group had trained vigorously with the aim of destroying the United States carrier fleet at one blow. They had had no opportunity for this in the Pearl Harbor attack because no aircraft carriers had been present that day. In the Indian Ocean operations that followed, however, they had demonstrated their proficiency by sending the British carrier Hermes, as well as cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall, to the bottom. Now the opportunity they had waited for seemed near at hand. No wonder excitement ran high. The leader of the torpedo bomber group was Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata from Akagi. When the Pearl Harbor operation had first been envisaged, an aerial torpedo attack was thought impossible because of the shallow harbor. It was through Murata's untiring and arduous efforts that this problem had been overcome, and he had led the torpedo planes to their brilliant successes in the Pearl Harbor strike. Now he hoped to display equal effectiveness on the open sea. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya of Akagi, who commanded the fighter escort group, was another veteran of long-flying experience. One of the senior fighter pilots of the fleet, his brilliant war record had already established him as an ace. Indeed, these three leaders were the best possible men for the job at hand, and their flyers were the elite of the naval air arm. In training, experience, and ability, there was no finer air combat team in the entire Japanese Navy. Admiral Nagumo had concluded that there was no enemy carrier group anywhere in the neighborhood of his force, yet he had prudently kept on hand his first-string team to pit against enemy carriers in case they should appear. Thus everything was in seeming readiness even for the unexpected. It remained only to give the signal if enemy ships were sighted, and the second attack wave would take care of the rest. Still, there was something disturbing about the situation. Since the search planes had set out only a short while earlier, it would probably be some time before we learned definitely from them whether or not an enemy force was in the vicinity. But this was not the only threat that might arise. It was also necessary to anticipate shore-based air attacks from Midway. Maneuvering as we were, within easy striking range of the island, with a full deckload of planes, we certainly presented an attractive target. Somehow we resembled a man walking through a lonely forest with a bag of gold on his shoulder, an inviting prey for the first robber who saw the chance to pounce upon him. Worried lest we be attacked in this vulnerable condition, I asked whether our fighter cover had taken off. "Yes, sir," was the reply. "After the first attack wave left, 9 fighters were launched from Kaga. Another 9 are now standing by on our flight deck. A total of 18 fighter planes to protect the entire striking force. In the event of an enemy attack, they would be powerless to stop it. But we had already committed 36 fighters to the Midway attack, and another 36 were being held in reserve in the second attack wave. That left just 18 fighters as combat air patrol for our force of 21 ships. I had a fear that we might lose flexibility by keeping half of our strength in standby reserve. Until an enemy fleet was discovered, or its absence confirmed, a full half of our striking strength had to be kept for immediate use, and because that readiness had to be maintained even though we should be attacked by land-based planes, our flexibility of operation seemed impaired from the very outset. Weakened by my exertions and somewhat worried over the tactical situation of our force, I suddenly felt dizzy and climbed down to my cabin beneath the flight deck to rest. My thoughts, however, were with Tomonaga and his flyers, about to strike the first blow at Midway. By 0445, the first attack wave had completed, forming up over the striking force, and after climbing to 4,000 meters, it sped off to the southeast. When still about 150 miles from the target, these planes were discovered by an enemy flying boat. Unsuspected, it shadowed them to within 30 miles of Midway, where it moved high above the formation to drop a parachute flare, alerting enemy interceptors which were already in the air in anticipation of the strike. Upon sighting the flare signal, enemy fighters swarmed to the attack. A savage air battle ensued from 0645 to 0710, but the tactical superiority of the Zero fighter again proved itself, and the enemy challenge was successfully repulsed. Thanks to the effective protection of Lieutenant Suganami's fighters, every one of our level bombers and 36 dive bombers arrived safely over the target. Suganami's success in blocking the enemy fighters from making a single hit on the bombers was a feat almost without parallel in the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ogawa's dive bombers screamed down on their targets through fierce anti-aircraft fire, releasing their 250-kilogram bombs at perilously low altitude. Simultaneously, 12 level bombers concentrated on an airstrip on Eastern Island with 800-kilogram bombs dropped from an altitude of 3,500 meters. The rest of the bombers demolished hangars and other installations on Eastern and Sand Islands. The absence of surprise sharply reduced the effectiveness of our attack. The fully alerted enemy had sent all of his planes aloft, some to intercept and attack, the others merely to take refuge. Finding no planes on the fields, Tomonaga's bombers attacked the hangars, which were easily destroyed, and the airstrip. But the loss of empty hangars was of little significance, and it was next to impossible for so few planes to effectively damage the airstrip. Lieutenant Tomonaga was well aware that the primary objective of the strike was to neutralize enemy air strength based on Midway. Since the first attack obviously had not achieved this goal, he concluded that it would be necessary to strike again in order to destroy the enemy planes when they returned to the island. Accordingly, as his planes headed back to the carriers, he radioed, "There is need for a second attack. Time 0700. Japanese losses in the first wave attack were negligible. 3 level bombers and 1 dive bomber were shot down by enemy anti-aircraft fire, and only 2 fighters failed to return." Post-war American accounts fully confirm that Midway's defenders were ready and waiting for the attack. At about 0520, as recounted later, an enemy PBY had spotted our carrier force and radioed a warning back to Midway. Another PBY had sighted the Japanese air formation 150 miles from the target and followed it in. Radar stations on Midway also picked up the formation and traced its approach. Shortly after 0600, every operational plane on the island took off, leaving the airstrips bare. The American fighters swiftly climbed for altitude so that they could pounce on the Japanese formations from above. All anti-aircraft batteries on the island were fully manned. When the PBY dropped its flare at a distance of 30 miles from the island to illuminate the attacking planes, the American interceptors dove into action from a 5,000-foot advantage. The strength of the Japanese force was exaggeratedly reported as 60 to 80 bombers and 50 Zero fighters. According to the American account, the defenders thought that they had shot down 53 Japanese planes during the attack, 10 by anti-aircraft fire and the rest by aerial combat, whereas there were actually only 6 Japanese planes that failed to return to the carriers. On the other hand, our flyers' claims of some 42 American planes destroyed were also exaggerated, though less flagrantly, since there were in all only 26 present. Of these, only 2 returned undamaged to the island, and the rest were either destroyed or badly shot up. The actual damage to Midway installations was, as we suspected, far from complete. However, the American account shows that the fuel supply system was so badly bombed that all subsequent fueling operations had to be carried out by hand. Some damage was done to the airstrip, and more than 20 casualties were suffered on the ground. The seaplane hangar and fuel storage tanks on Sand Island were destroyed. Back on Akagi, the departure of the Midway attack force had been followed by anxious waiting, both for news of the strike itself and for enemy counteraction which had to be expected momentarily. For the latter we had not long to wait. After descending from the flight deck, I had been in my bunk but a few minutes when a bugle sounded the alarm. "Air raid!" This was followed almost at once by the strident roar of interceptors taking off. I counted the planes as they raced down the deck directly overhead. 9 fighters took off. I shouted unheard encouragement to the pilots, but was too feeble to rise from my bunk. A glance at my watch showed the time to be 0520. The sudden quiet after the plane's takeoff was broken shortly by the shattering bark of our anti-aircraft guns. My weakness was again overcome by an insistent impulse to see what was happening, and I struggled up once more to the flight command post, where the air officer informed me that the target was a flying boat. An enemy PBY had sighted our force. Editor's note: this plane from Midway made the first U.S. contact with the Japanese carriers. It also reported the Japanese air attack force heading toward the island. The American carriers at this time were about 200 miles ENE of the Nagumo force. I asked a lookout if our fighters had shot down the PBY, and his negative reply surprised me. The air officer explained. The PBY managed to elude them by a very cunning maneuver. It was first sighted to the south, flying at about 4,000 meters. The pilot came directly overhead as if to bomb us. By the time our fighters got up to meet him, he had disappeared eastward into the clouds. We thought he had given up the contact, but he came back again. Our fighters still failed to catch him because of the clouds. Now he seems to be gone for good. A report came from our radio monitors that a long message was being sent by an enemy plane, obviously nearby because the reception was very clear. It must be the PBY's report of our position. Now we were sure to be attacked. It was just a question of what would strike us and how soon. Again, worn out by my exertion, I collapsed on the deck, helpless and giddy. An officer placed a parachute pack under my head as a pillow, and I lay there watching the brightening sky and listening to the commotion about me. At 05351 of Tone's search planes, launched half an hour earlier, radioed that it had sighted an enemy flying boat 40 miles out, heading for our carriers. Either the PBY, which had already spotted us, was coming back to resume the contact, or another was moving in for the same purpose. All eyes on Akagi's bridge searched the horizon, but for some minutes no flying boat came into sight. Then, at 0542, a bridge-top lookout suddenly shouted, "Enemy flying boat, starboard beam, elevation 50 degrees, above the clouds, visible at intervals." Everyone fixed his gaze in the direction indicated, and the air officer called out, "There it is, very high, over 4,000 meters." A minute later, fighters were roaring off Akagi's deck to pursue the intruder. During the next hour, there was a confusing succession of reported contacts on our force, both by individual flying boats and by small numbers of enemy planes of unidentified type. There was also a further radio warning from Tone's search plane at 0555 that 15 enemy planes were heading toward us. The formation upped its speed to 28 knots, and Tone, after sighting 3 planes overhead at 0643, began making smoke to provide concealment against attack. Since no attack took place during this entire period, however, some of the reported contacts must have been erroneous or on our own fighters patrolling overhead. But there was no question that enemy flying boats were shadowing us, skillfully maneuvering in and out of the clouds to elude pursuit. Each time one of the persistent PBYs was sighted, now to starboard, now to port, Akagi's harassed fighter director would shout orders to our combat air patrol to go after it. The enemy pilots, however, were so adept at weaving through the clouds that the fighters merely exhausted themselves to no avail. While our own movements were thus observed and reported continuously, there was still no warning from our own search planes of any enemy task force. At 0700, Lieutenant Tomonaga's message recommending a second strike against Midway was received on the bridge of flagship Akagi. Still, no enemy planes had yet attacked our force, but almost immediately thereafter Tomonaga's recommendation was underlined by the first of a series of desperate shore-based air assaults, which amply proved to Admiral Nagumo that enemy air strength on Midway had not been eliminated. At 0705 a bugle sounded, "Air Raid," and all eyes in the flight command post turned toward the southern sky. I managed to pull myself up for a look and noticed that it had become a beautiful day. There was fairly heavy cloud cover at about 6,000 feet, but the air was clear and visibility good. A destroyer in the van section of our ring formation suddenly hoisted a flag signal, "Enemy planes in sight." Emitting a cloud of black smoke to underline the warning, she opened fire with her anti-aircraft guns. Soon we spotted 4 planes approaching from 20 degrees to port. They looked like torpedo bombers, but before they could get close enough to permit confirmation, our fighters had pounced upon them and shot down 3, causing loud cheers all around me. The last plane gave up the attack and withdrew with our Zeros in hot pursuit. A bridge-top lookout was heard from a moment later. 6 medium land-based planes approaching, 20 degrees to starboard, on the horizon. Scanning the sky to starboard, sure enough, I saw the enemy planes flying in a single column. It looked as if the enemy had planned a converging attack from both flanks, but fortunately for us, the timing was off. Following the lead destroyers, our cruisers opened fire. Then battleship Kirishima, to starboard of Akagi, loosed her main batteries at the attackers. Still they kept coming in, flying low over the water. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire blossomed all around them, but none of the raiders went down. As Akagi's guns commenced firing, 3 Zeros braved our own anti-aircraft barrage and dove down on the Americans. In a moment's time, 3 of the enemy were set aflame and splashed into the water, raising tall columns of smoke. The remaining 3 planes kept bravely on and finally released their torpedoes. Free of their cargo, the attacking planes swung sharply to the right and away, except for the lead plane which skimmed straight over Akagi from starboard to port, nearly grazing the bridge. The white star on the fuselage of the plane, a B-26, was plainly visible. Immediately after clearing our ship, it burst into flames and plunged into the sea. About this time, several torpedoes passed to port of Akagi, trailing their pale white wakes. Akagi had manoeuvred so skillfully that not one torpedo scored, and everyone breathed a deep sigh of relief. This attack actually consisted of 6 torpedo planes, TBF Avengers, and 4 B-26S Marauders, all armed with torpedoes, which had taken off unescorted from Midway at 0615. American accounts indicate that 1 TBF and 2 B-26AS were all that returned from the attack. Admiral Nagumo needed no further convincing that Midway should be hit again, and he felt that it would be safe to do so as no enemy surface force had yet been reported. Consequently, at 0715, just as the torpedo attack was ending, he ordered the planes of the second wave, which had been armed for an attack on enemy ships, to prepare instead for another strike on Midway. This meant that the torpedo-laden level bombers on Akagi and Kaga had to be de-armed and reloaded with bombs. Editor's note: only Akagi and Kaga were affected because, as described earlier, the torpedo bomber group of the second attack wave was composed of planes from these 2 carriers, with Hiryu and Soryu providing the dive bomber group. The torpedo bombers of Hiryu and Soryu had gone out with the first attack wave, in which the dive bomber group had come from Akagi and Kaga. The ones already on the flight deck were taken down to the hangar one after another, and the rearming began. Flying crews and maintenance men worked furiously at the arduous task. There was only a brief respite before the Nagumo force was attacked again. Just before 0800, an Akagi lookout reported that enemy bombers were attacking Hiryu. Dark geysers of water were seen rising up around the carrier, and in the next instant identical columns were rising around Soryu. But there was no black smoke to indicate a direct hit on either ship. When the curtains of water settled, the 2 carriers were still steaming ahead, evidently unharmed. I consulted an aircraft recognition chart and found that Soryu's attackers were B-17S, the latest model United States Army bomber. There were 14 in all. A study of post-war American sources shows that these planes took off from Midway before dawn to attack the Japanese transport convoy, but were diverted to the carriers. After dropping their bomb loads of more than 4 tons per plane from an altitude of 20,000 feet, they returned safely to base and optimistically reported having scored 4 hits on 2 carriers. I was chagrined to see that none of our fighters pursued the B-17S. Recalling the reported toughness of these big planes, however, I realized that the 20mm guns of our fighters would have had a hard time knocking them down anyway. Meanwhile, the forts roared defiantly away. Our anti-aircraft fire concentrated on them, but registered no hits. About this time, all Zeros of our second attack wave were sent up to augment our combat air patrol. At 0800, a lookout reported a group of small planes coming from the direction of Midway. The lead destroyers of our screen sent up a billow of smoke and opened fire on them. Their attack method was puzzling as they came in too high for torpedo attack and too low for dive bombing. They approached in shallow dives, heading straight for Hiryu. There were 16 planes in all, widely scattered. They were jumped by 10 or more Zeros, which sent one after another spinning into the sea. Even when half of them had been shot down, the remaining planes bravely held their course and finally released bombs which seemed certain to hit the carrier. But when the bomb splashes and smoke cleared, Hiryu was still intact, steaming on as gallantly as ever. It struck me as strange that the American planes had not employed their customary highly effective hell-diving technique in this attack. This was explained in post-war accounts of the American side of the action. The leader of these 16 Marine Corps dive bombers, SBDs, had taken off from Midway about an hour before, knowing full well that his pilots were not experienced in dive bombing. Accordingly, upon sighting the carriers, he decided on a glide bombing attack. Half of these planes never returned to their base, and 6 of the ones that did were damaged beyond repair. We had by this time undergone every kind of air attack by shore-based planes, torpedo, level bombing, dive bombing, but were still unscathed. Frankly, it was my judgment that the enemy flyers were not displaying a very high level of ability, and this evaluation was shared by Admiral Nagumo and his staff. It was our general conclusion that we had little to fear from the enemy's offensive tactics. But paradoxically, the very ineffectiveness of the enemy attacks up to this time contributed in no small measure to the ultimate American triumph. We neglected certain obvious precautions which, had they been taken, might have prevented the fiasco that followed a few hours later. The apparently futile sacrifices made by the enemy's shore-based planes were, after all, not in vain. As the glide-bombing attack ended, a destroyer on the far side of our ring formation made a smoke signal that it had spotted more enemy planes. Almost 100 were counted. The destroyer opened fire on them but stopped abruptly after a few rounds, upon recognizing that it was our first attack wave returning from Midway. The time was 0830. Owing to the independent evasive maneuvering of our ships during the enemy air attacks and the peripatetic movements of the carriers while launching and recovering fighter planes, our once compact cruising disposition had become widely dispersed. It was therefore desirable to take advantage of the lull in the attacks to reform, but now the recovery of Tomonaga's planes was of greater urgency. With the veteran flyers we had at this time, speedy recovery operations on board the carriers, even under stringent battle conditions, were little more than child's play. Given 15 minutes from the time the ship turned into the wind, a carrier's whole complement of planes could put down on her deck with expert skill. No time was lost in getting the recovery underway. On each carrier the order was given, "Clear the deck to recover planes." Akagi again became a hive of activity. The uncomplaining crews, egged on by exhortations to "hurry it up," fell to their jobs with tremendous energy. In a matter of minutes the flight deck was clear, and at 0837 a signal streamed from the yardarm, "Commence landing." The returning planes orbited and swooped to the deck in rapid succession. By shortly after 0900, all 4 carriers had recovered their planes. 3 of our crippled bombers circled once over Hiryu before coming into land. Lieutenant Commander Masu Kawaguchi, in charge of recovery operations, instantly summoned a surgeon to the command post. One of the planes had to land on a single wheel. Lieutenant Hiroharu Kadono, the pilot, lost consciousness the moment his plane jolted to a halt. He had been hit in the leg by a machine gun bullet when enemy fighters attacked the formation near the target. Despite the pain of his wound, he flew on with the formation, made the attack, and managed to return to the carrier. Lieutenant Tomonaga's plane was hit in the left-wing fuel tank, but he too managed to get back. His report included an account of the gallant death of Lieutenant Rokuro Kikuchi, a bomber pilot from Hiryu, whose plane had been fatally hit by anti-aircraft fire over the island. Kikuchi had opened the canopy, waved goodbye to his comrades, then closed it firmly and plunged headlong to the ground. Already, however, about an hour before Tomonaga's Midway strike planes got back to the carriers, there had been a development which completely altered the battle situation confronting Admiral Nagumo. Tone's No. 4 search plane, which had been launched a full half-hour behind schedule, finally reached its 300-mile search limit on course 100 degrees at 0720, and it then veered north to fly a 60-mile dogleg before heading back. 8 minutes later, its observer suddenly discerned, far off to port, a formation of some 10 ships heading southeast. Without waiting until it could get a closer look, the plane immediately flashed a message to the Nagumo force. 10 ships apparently enemy sighted, bearing 010 degree, distant 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed more than 20 knots. Time 0728. This vital message was received by the flagship only after several minutes' delay, occasioned by the relaying of the message through tone. Editor's note: documentary evidence is both contradictory and inconclusive as to the exact time this message was received. The Nagumo Force official report states, in its narrative summary of the operation, that the message was received at about 0500-0800 Midway time. This, however, is clearly shown to be inaccurate by entries in the detailed action log contained in the same document, these entries establishing that, at 0745 and again at 0747, as related immediately following, Admiral Nagumo dispatched orders indicating prior receipt of the tone search plane report. The action log also shows that other messages from the tone plane, where both sending and receipt times were given, were received either simultaneously with their sending or, in a few cases, with a delay of not more than 10 minutes evidently caused by relaying of the messages. 1st Air Fleet Detailed Battle Report, No. 6, the 15th of June 1942, pp. 6, 28, 32. Equivalent references in English translation of this document: U.S. Navy, Oni Publication OPNAV P. 32, 1002. The Japanese Story of the Battle of Midway, RPP 7, 13, 16. When it reached Admiral Nagumo and his staff on Akagi's bridge, it struck them like a bolt from the blue. Until this moment, no one had anticipated that an enemy surface force could possibly appear so soon, much less suspected that enemy ships were already in the vicinity waiting to ambush us. Now the entire picture was changed. Lieutenant Commander Ono, the staff intelligence officer, quickly plotted the enemy's reported position on the navigation chart and measured off the distance between it and our force. The enemy was just 200 miles away. This meant that he was already within striking range of our planes, but if he had carriers, we were also within his reach. The big question now was what composed the enemy force. Above all, did it contain any carriers? The complete lack of information in the search plane report on the makeup of the enemy force caused both concern and irritation to Admiral Nagumo, Chief of Staff Kusaka, and the other staff officers. 10 ships, apparently enemy, was not a very illuminating description. Obviously the ships could only be enemy, but what types were present? At 0747, a peremptory order was flashed to the tone plane: ascertain ship types and maintain contact. 2 minutes before this, Admiral Nagumo had already taken another action made imperative by the sighting of the enemy. Since 0715 Akagi and Kaga, whose torpedo bombers had been held back in the second attack wave, had been hurriedly rearming them with 800-kilogram bombs in place of torpedoes for another strike on Midway. The rearming had by this time been more than half completed. Now, however, it was urgently necessary to maintain readiness to meet the enemy fleet, in case further information from the tone plane confirmed it to be a real threat to the Nagumo force. Therefore, at 0745, Admiral Nagumo ordered the rearming of the 2 carriers' torpedo bombers to be immediately suspended and directed his whole force to prepare for a possible attack on enemy ships. At 0758, the tone search plane radioed that the enemy had changed course to 080 degree, but again the ship types were not mentioned. The staff officers were now fuming with angry impatience, and at 0800 another dispatch went out, ordering the search plane to report the composition of the enemy force immediately. Finally, at 0809 the reply came in: enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. "Just as I thought," Ono said triumphantly. "There are no carriers." He handed the message to the Chief of Staff. Nagumo Force Dawn searches, the 4th of June 1942, west longitude date, zone +12 time. Editor's note: original chart in Japanese text showed only generalized position of U.S. forces WNW of plane, C. Their position as reported by the plane is shown at A, while B is their position as supplied from American sources. It is probable that the plane's calculations were grossly in error and that the plane was off its scheduled course. Kusaka's reaction was that, if the enemy force was without carriers, it could safely be taken care of later, and the Nagumo force could first finish destroying enemy air strength based on Midway. The relief inspired by the 0809 message, however, was short-lived. At 0820, the tone plane was heard from again, and this time it reported, "Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier bringing up the rear." This information electrified everyone, but there was still a residue of doubt because of the words "appears to be." The identification was not certain, and if the enemy force did include a carrier, why hadn't carrier-type aircraft yet joined in the attacks on the Nagumo force? So reasoned the optimists. At 0830, still another message came in from the tone plane. It reported, "2 additional enemy ships, apparently cruisers, sighted, bearing 008 degree, distant 250 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. From the size of the enemy force, Admiral Nagumo now concluded that it must contain at least one carrier. It was therefore essential, he decided, to attack these ships before launching another strike on Midway. However, serious obstacles stood in the way of an immediate attack. Not only had the greater part of Akagi's and Kaga's torpedo bombers already been rearmed with bombs by the time Admiral Nagumo ordered the rearming suspended at 0745, but in addition, all Zeros of the second attack wave fighter escort had been sent aloft to reinforce our combat air patrol against the repeated attacks by enemy shore-based planes. As a result, the only planes that were actually armed appropriately for an attack on enemy ships and lined up on the flight decks ready for takeoff were the 36 dive bombers of Hiryu and Soryu. Admiral Nagumo's dilemma was a difficult one, indeed. If he launched the dive bombers for a forestalling attack on the enemy task force, they would have no fighter protection, and losses might be severe. Also, there was the question of whether to use the torpedo bombers now lined up on the flight decks of Akagi and Kaga, but already rearmed with 800-kilogram bombs. Editor's note. As their rearming was completed, these planes had again been brought up to the flight decks of the 2 carriers, apparently remaining there when further rearming was suspended. Such planes as had not yet been changed over from torpedoes to bombs evidently remained below on the hangar deck. These bombs, though less effective than torpedoes against a ship target, could still inflict severe damage if hits were scored. But the torpedo bombers required fighter protection far more even than the dive bombers. To bomb effectively, they must maintain a straight and level course, which gives no opportunity for evasive maneuvering. Without protective escort, they would be easy prey for nimble enemy fighters. As Admiral Nagumo pondered his course of action, the return of Tomonaga's planes from the Midway strike made a quick decision imperative. Some of the planes were in distress, and the fighter escorts were running low on fuel, so that their recovery could not be long delayed without risking added losses. Either the carrier's decks must be cleared by launching the dive and torpedo bombers to attack the enemy without fighter cover, or the planes must be moved to make way for the recovery, thus making it impossible to launch an attack until some time later. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander of Cardiff II, chose this moment to make an urgent recommendation to Admiral Nagumo. In his flagship, Hiryu, which was maneuvering at some distance from Akagi, he had anxiously been following the successive sighting reports from Tone's search plane, and Admiral Nagumo's failure to order prompt offensive action against the enemy task force struck him as unwise and dangerous. He now addressed a signal to his superior, relayed by destroyer Nowaki. The signal read, "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately." In Admiral Nagumo's judgment, however, the risks involved in sending out an attack force without fighter protection were too great. The slaughter of the unescorted American planes which had attacked his ships within the past hour and a half was, after all, pretty convincing proof of that. A wiser course, he thought, was first to recover both the Midway strike planes and the second wave fighters which had been diverted to combat air patrol, then to reorganize his forces while temporarily retiring northward to avoid further air attack, and finally, when all preparations were complete, to turn around and destroy the enemy task force by an all-out attack. Nagumo's reasoning was logical enough. His force was well balanced and appeared greatly superior in strength. Therefore, it would be easy to destroy the enemy if all his striking power were thrown into a single massive attack. Such strategy was orthodox, but it had one flaw: neglect of the time factor. Victory in battle does not always go to the stronger. It often goes to the side which is quicker to act boldly and decisively to meet unforeseen developments and to grasp fleeting opportunities. By his decision, taken shortly after 0830, to recover the Midway strike before doing anything else, Admiral Nagumo virtually committed himself to the second, more cautious plan of action. On board Akagi, when the order was given to clear the deck for recovery, the weary maintenance crews began once more to lower the torpedo bombers to the hangar deck. There, the orders now were to switch back from bombs to torpedoes. Flight Officer Masuda, whose light-heartedness and good nature seemed to prevail under any circumstances, greeted these instructions with amazingly cheerful astonishment. "Here we go again," he exclaimed. "This is getting to be like a quick change contest." While the returning planes came down one after another on the flight deck, the work of rearming the torpedo bombers on the hangar deck below proceeded furiously. The crew, clad only in tropical shorts and half-sleeved shirts, hastily unloaded the heavy bombs, just piling them up beside the hangar because there was no time to lower them to the magazine. There would be cause to recall and regret this haphazard disposal of the lethal missiles when enemy bombs later found their mark in Akagi. At 0855, as the recovery operations neared completion, Admiral Nagumo acted to put the rest of his plan into execution. A blinker signal sent out to all ships ordered, "After completing recovery operations, force will temporarily head northward. We plan to contact and destroy enemy task force." Simultaneously with this order, Admiral Nagumo dispatched a radio to Admiral Yamamoto in Yamato and to Vice Admiral Kondo, commanding the Midway invasion force, to inform them of the critical new developments. The message said, "Enemy force of 1 carrier, 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers discovered at 0800, bearing 010 degree, distant 240 miles from Midway. We will head for it." Editor's note. The inaccuracies and omissions in this message are interesting. By telescoping together the various tone search plane reports and giving a single median time of 0800, it could have led Admiral Yamamoto, had he not also received these reports, to believe that the enemy force had first been discovered a half-hour later than it actually was. This undoubtedly bears a close relation to the obviously inaccurate statement in the narrative portion of the Nagumo Force Official Action Report, referred to earlier, with regard to the time of receipt of the tone plane's 0728 message. The message is further inaccurate in that the sighting position given is the position as of 0728, when the enemy was first spotted, and not as of 0800, and also in that it fails to mention the 2 additional cruisers reported by the tone plane at 0830, 25 minutes before this message was dispatched. Finally, it is curious that the message concludes, "We will head for it, the enemy force," without mentioning the temporary northward retirement while preparing to attack. In this connection, the Onai translation of the Nagumo Force Report translates the above-quoted part of the message, "We are heading for it." But as the vagaries of Japanese syntax allow either a present or future meaning of the verb, it appears fairer to Admiral Nagumo to choose the future rendition as given in this account. By 0918, the recovery of the last plane of the Midway attack force, as well as the second wave fighters on combat air patrol, had been completed. Course was set at 030 degree, and the force sped on at 30 knots to lessen the danger from Midway-based air, and at the same time achieve a position of advantage over the enemy fleet. During all this feverish activity and excitement, I had remained prostrate on the deck at the flight command post, a helpless spectator of events. Our success in beating off the much-feared attacks by enemy shore-based planes had led me to share the prevailing optimism, Then someone had told me of the sighting of the enemy task force, but I did not learn until after the operation the details of the discussions on Akagi's bridge, which led up to Admiral Nagumo's final decision to defer action until he could mount an all-out attack. Unaware of these deliberations, I felt relieved that our second attack wave had not yet been committed to Midway, at the same time regretting the hasty rearming of our torpedo bombers for a land attack. At least I thought the dive bomber group from Hiryu and Soryu was ready to attack the enemy, and I expected that it would be ordered off the carriers momentarily. This expectation and hope waned as the recovery of the first attack wave got underway with no sign that the dive bombers had yet taken off. It gave way to dismayed surprise when I learned of Admiral Nagumo's order issued at 0855, indicating that no attack would be launched until we had time to reorganize our forces while temporarily retiring northward. Looking back on this critical moment, which ultimately was to decide the battle, I can easily realize what a difficult choice faced the force commander. Yet, even now, I find it hard to justify the decision he took. Should he not have sacrificed every other consideration in favor of sending the dive bombers immediately against the enemy ships? Should he not have dispatched the torpedo bombers also, even though armed with bombs? He could have launched them to orbit until enough fighters could be recovered, refueled, and launched again to provide escort.